Nestled in the heart of New York City, Lauren Bacall's elegant brownstone has long been a subject of admiration. However, behind its stately facade lies a chilling history that has unnerved even the most skeptical visitors. After Bacall's death in 2014, the house, which she called home for decades, began to take on a darker reputation. Tenants and visitors have repeatedly reported hearing rustles, as if someone were moving through the house when no one else was present. Late at night, footsteps echo through the hallways, but upon investigation, the spaces are eerily empty. One particularly unnerving phenomenon involves sightings of a shadowy figure resembling Bacall herself. Tenants describe a tall, elegant silhouette, her iconic presence unmistakable even in death. The figure is most often seen near the grand piano in the living room, a place she reportedly loved to sit and read. A former tenant recounted a night when she awoke to the sound of soft humming coming from the piano room. Gathering her courage, she crept downstairs, only to find the lid of the piano raised, though she distinctly remembered closing it earlier. As she stood frozen in fear, she caught sight of a fleeting shadow moving toward the staircase. The experiences don't end with physical sounds and movements. A contractor hired to renovate the house reported feeling an unseen presence watching him. Tools would mysteriously vanish, only to reappear in places no one had entered. He left the project midway, citing an unshakable unease. Neighbors, too, have stories. One claimed to have seen the silhouette of a woman in the window long after the house was supposed to be empty. It looked like her, the neighbor said. That same poise, the way she stood like she was waiting for something. While many dismiss these occurrences as overactive imaginations or urban legends, those who have lived or worked in the house tell a different story. Whether it's the lingering essence of a legendary actress or simply the energy of a life well lived, one thing is certain. Lauren Bacall's home remains a place of intrigue and mystery. Some say the house is a tribute to her memory, while others believe she never truly left. The chilling occurrences at Lauren Bacall's former residence only deepened with time, as though the house itself was reluctant to let its secrets rest. A particularly unnerving series of events began with the arrival of a young journalist named Clara, who moved into the house with the intention of writing a memoir about the actress. Eager to immerse herself in Bacall's world, Clara turned the grand piano room into her workspace, filling it with old photographs and memorabilia she had collected. From the moment she settled in, Clara noticed oddities. At first, they were subtle. The faint scent of Bacall's signature perfume drifting through the hallways, or the peculiar way the light seemed to dim slightly when she approached the piano. Then, one evening, while poring over Bacall's interviews, Clara heard a distinct creak on the staircase behind her. She turned, expecting to see her cat, but found only an empty staircase bathed in shadow. Determined to remain logical, Clara brushed off the incident until the whispers began. Late at night, as the city hummed outside, Clara would hear faint voices murmuring through the walls. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably conversational, as if a group of unseen guests were gathered in the next room. She searched the house repeatedly, finding nothing but the oppressive silence that followed her every step. One night, as Clara sat at the piano, tracing her fingers over the keys, she felt a chill run through the air. Without thinking, she played a few notes, simple, soft chords. A beat passed, and then she heard it. A faint, echoing hum, almost as if someone were singing along. Heart racing, Clara froze, her hands hovering over the keys. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than usual. She could have sworn she saw a figure, a silhouette of a woman with striking features, watching her with an intensity that made the air feel thick. The sightings and sounds escalated in the weeks that followed. Objects Clara swore she had placed on her desk would reappear near the piano. Once, she found an old cigarette case that hadn't been there before, its silver surface etched with the initials LB. When she reached out to touch it, a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the windows shut with such force that it rattled the frames. Despite her growing unease, Clara couldn't bring herself to leave. There was something hypnotic about the house, something that whispered to her in the dead of night, urging her to uncover its secrets. She began digging deeper, poring over property records, Bacall's personal letters, and any scrap of history tied to the house. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The house wasn't just a home for Bacall, it had a history of its own, dating back to the early 1900s. Several former residents had reported strange occurrences long before the actress had moved in. Whispers of unexplained disappearances, peculiar deaths, and a legend about a secret room hidden within its walls painted a picture far more sinister than Clara had anticipated. One night, unable to resist the pull of curiosity, Clara decided to search for the room. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, she traced the walls of the basement, tapping for hollow spaces. Hours passed with no success, but just as she was about to give up, her flashlight flickered and went out. In the pitch-black silence, Clara heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a soft, feminine hum. It was closer this time, almost as if it were right behind her. Slowly, she turned, but before she could see anything, the flashlight sputtered back to life, illuminating the cracked plaster of a hidden door embedded in the wall. And then, from the other side, she heard a whisper, "Why are you here? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Clara's breath hitched as the whisper curled around her like a tendril of smoke, intangible yet suffocating. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, its beam unsteady as it illuminated the jagged edges of the hidden door. The voice was soft but deliberate, each word infused with an almost intimate menace. Clara hesitated. Was it her imagination, or had the whisper sounded eerily familiar? Like a voice she had heard in recordings of Lauren Bacall, low and sultry, tinged with a knowing lilt. The thought sent a shiver racing down her spine, but curiosity burned hotter than her fear. She reached for the crowbar, jamming it into the cracks of the plaster, the faint sound of crumbling dust filling the air. As she pried the door open, a sudden gust of air rushed out, cold and stale, carrying with it a faint, almost metallic scent. Her flashlight flickered again, the beam now weak and sputtering. The room beyond was a void of darkness, but she felt it a palpable weight pressing against her chest, like the air itself was alive and watching. Clara stepped inside. The space was smaller than she expected, a narrow chamber lined with dusty shelves and crumbling walls. A single chair sat in the center, its wooden frame warped with age. On the floor beneath it lay a scattering of yellowed papers and what looked like an old, cracked photograph. Clara knelt down, picking up the photo with trembling hands. It was Bacall, her unmistakable features frozen in a candid moment. She was sitting in the very same chair, her gaze turned slightly to the side, as though looking at someone or something just outside the frame. Behind her, the faint outlines of words were scrawled on the wall, nearly obliterated by time. Clara squinted, tilting the flashlight to reveal the faded writing. The words, written in an elegant, hurried script, read, "She won't let me leave." Before Clara could process the meaning, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The door slammed shut with a force that sent vibrations through the walls. She scrambled to her feet, the flashlight casting erratic beams as it spun from her grasp. The room plunged into darkness, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Then came the laughter. It started as a low chuckle, deep and throaty, reverberating through the chamber like the roll of distant thunder. It grew louder, more mocking, until it filled the space, drowning out Clara's panicked breaths. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, heart pounding in her ears, as the laughter suddenly stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, a voice clearer this time, unmistakably Bacall's whispered just behind her ear, "You should have stayed away." The walls felt as though they were closing in, the air thick with the scent of Bacall's perfume and something acrid, almost sulfuric. Clara's hand fumbled for her phone, desperate for light or contact with the outside world. But when she turned it on, the screen displayed a single, ominous message. "Leave if you can." As Clara stumbled toward the door, her flashlight sputtering weakly, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing just beyond the hidden chamber. Each step grew closer, echoing like a countdown. And then, from the corner of the room, A shadow began to form, darker than the blackness surrounding it. The figure seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, taking shape as it glided forward. It stopped just short of the light's feeble edge, its face obscured but unmistakably human. A voice, low and resonant, filled the room. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a command. "You don't belong here." Clara froze, her eyes locked on the shifting figure. The shadow tilted its head, as if considering her, and then it began to move closer. The shadow moved with an unnerving grace, its edges blurring as though it wasn't entirely tethered to this world. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her hands trembling as she gripped the flashlight. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, trapped beneath the weight of the oppressive air. The figure halted just within the edge of the dim light, its head tilting again, almost curiously. Though its face was obscured, Clara felt its gaze intense and piercing, as though it were peeling away layers of her thoughts, exposing her fears. Then it spoke again, this time in a voice layered with a chorus of others. It was Bacall's voice, but it wasn't just hers. Male and female voices blended into an eerie symphony of speech. "Why do you seek what should remain hidden?" Clara swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She mustered every ounce of courage she had left and whispered, What do you want?" The shadow didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised an arm, or what could only be described as an approximation of one. The darkness seemed to stretch, elongating toward her, and the room's temperature dropped sharply. Clara's breath formed clouds in the air. Her fingers numb as frost crept along the edges of the walls. It pointed to the photograph still clutched in her hand. Clara looked down and realized something had changed. The image now showed not just Bacall, but another figure standing behind her, a dark silhouette, its form eerily similar to the one standing before her now. The scrawled words on the wall had also shifted, clearer and more menacing. "Don't trust it." Before she could process the warning, the chamber around her began to vibrate. Shelves rattled, ancient dust cascading from the ceiling in thick clouds. The sound of laughter returned, louder now, bouncing off the confined walls until it felt like it was coming from every direction. Desperate to escape, Clara lunged for the door. Her hands fumbled against the smooth surface, but there was no handle, no seam, only cold, unyielding stone. Behind her, the shadow moved closer, and with every inch it gained, the room seemed to darken further, swallowing the weak light of her flashlight. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The voices swirled again, overlapping in a cacophony that made her head pound. Then, one voice rose above the others, distinct and chillingly calm. "You opened the door. Now you must see." The shadow lunged, and Clara's world spiraled into darkness. When she awoke, she was no longer in the chamber. Instead, she found herself sitting at the grand piano in the living room. The photograph was gone, and the room was unnervingly still, bathed in the faint glow of morning light. But something was different. The piano's keys were smeared with what looked like ash, and when she touched them, her fingers tingled, as though the instrument pulsed with a faint, unnatural warmth. As she stood, unsteady, she caught a glimpse of the mirror above the fireplace. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw someone standing behind her, a tall, elegant woman with piercing eyes. But when she turned, the room was empty. Clara's phone buzzed on the desk, startling her. She grabbed it with shaking hands, relief washing over her at the thought of human connection. But when she looked at the screen, her blood turned to ice. A single message glowed against the dark background. "Did you find the truth?" And beneath it, an attachment, a photograph. It was of Clara, sitting in the hidden chamber, her face pale and terrified, the shadow looming behind her. The laughter began again, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the house. Clara's fingers went numb as she stared at the photograph on her phone. It was impossible she hadn't taken it. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she studied the image. The shadow behind her seemed more defined than she remembered, its features almost human but twisted in a way her mind couldn't fully comprehend. Before she could react, the screen of her phone glitched, the image flickering before dissolving into static. Then, a new sound broke through the oppressive silence. A soft, deliberate knock. It wasn't coming from the front door. The sound repeated, louder this time, echoing through the cavernous house. Clara turned toward its source, the staircase leading to the second floor. The knock wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, a cadence almost like footsteps. Gathering her courage, Clara inched toward the staircase, her flashlight once again her only defense. As she ascended, the air grew heavier, thick with an electric charge that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. Each step groaned under her weight, and she swore she felt the house breathe beneath her feet. At the top of the stairs, the knocking stopped. Clara paused, her heart hammering in her chest, and glanced down the hallway. It was dim, the morning light barely filtering through the heavy curtains. The doors to the bedrooms stood ajar, their shadows stretching like jagged teeth across the floor. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a single door was closed. It wasn't one she remembered seeing before. It was too ornate, the wood dark and polished, with an intricate carving of a phoenix rising from flames. The detail was unsettlingly lifelike, as though the bird might burst into motion at any moment. Something compelled her to approach. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, its brass surface icy to the touch. The instant her fingers closed around it, a voice spoke from behind her, low and resonant. "Don't." Clara spun around, but the hallway was empty. The air seemed to ripple, as though something unseen had just moved past her. She glanced back at the door, its carved phoenix now gleaming faintly, almost as if it were watching her. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything she'd seen in the house before. It was impossibly large, far bigger than the house should have allowed. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not just Clara but distorted versions of herself, some smiling, others staring with hollow eyes, and a few whispering inaudibly. In the center of the room stood a table. On it lay an open journal, its pages fluttering despite the absence of any breeze. Clara approached cautiously, the whispers from the mirrors growing louder with each step. She peered at the journal's pages, her breath catching as she read the words scrawled in a jagged hand. She wanted to leave, but the house wouldn't let her. "Now it's my turn." The ink was fresh, still glistening under the dim light, and Clara realized with growing horror that the handwriting was her own. Suddenly, the mirrors began to crack, fractures spreading like veins across their surfaces. From the shards, shadows spilled into the room, pooling on the floor and coalescing into a familiar shape, the same figure from the photograph. The shadow stood silent for a moment, its head tilting in that unsettling, predatory way. Then, it stepped forward, its distorted face finally becoming clear. It wasn't Bacall. It was Clara. Her own face stared back at her, twisted with malice, its eyes empty and black. The reflection smiled, its expression dripping with a sinister knowing. "It's your turn now," it whispered, the voice not just in her ears but inside her very mind. The room began to spin, the shadows closing in, and Clara stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grip. As darkness consumed her, the last thing she saw was her own reflection, leaning closer, its smile growing wider. Then the laughter returned this time. It was unmistakably her own. The laughter echoed in Clara's ears as everything around her dissolved into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the living room, seated at the grand piano. Her hands rested on the keys, but the once warm instrument now felt icy cold. She blinked, disoriented, her gaze sweeping the room. It looked the same, yet something felt profoundly wrong. She stood slowly, her movements sluggish, and turned toward the mirror above the fireplace. Her reflection stared back, but it wasn't her, not entirely. The face was hers, but the eyes were wrong. Black, hollow, and brimming with malice. As she raised her hand to touch her face, her reflection didn't follow. Instead, it smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent a chill through her. From the shadows of the house, the faint sound of heels clicking on the wooden floor echoed. A low, familiar voice, Lauren Bacall's, whispered, soft but unmistakable. "Welcome home, darling." The lights flickered, and the mirror shattered, plunging the house into silence. Clara's scream never escaped her lips. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.